Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is August 17th, 2010, and my guest is Daniel Pink. His latest book is Drive, The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us. Dan, welcome back to EconTalk.
It's great to be here once again, Russ.
Now, your book argues that we have the wrong models of motivation in how we understand business and education. Explain what you think has changed in motivation and what we ought to do about it.
Well, I went back and looked at about 50 years of research in behavioral science, mostly psychology, and then in recent years a little bit of economics. And what it says, at least the way I read the research fairly clearly, is that the classic set of motivators that we use inside of businesses, but also I think in schools and in our families, what I call if-then motivators. If you do this, then you get that. They work pretty well for certain kinds of things. They work pretty well for relatively simple, straightforward, algorithmic sort of work. Work where you're turning the same screw the same way on an assembly line, or stuffing envelopes, or adding up columns of figures in a white-collar office. The evidence is pretty clear. They get you to focus. They do reasonably well. The trouble is that for work that requires greater complexity, greater creativity, greater conceptual thinking, there's a fair amount of evidence that says that those kinds of motivators, again, the if-then motivators, often don't work very well and can sometimes backfire. And my contention is that most work in advanced economies is becoming less routine and algorithmic, because that kind of work you can send overseas or automate it. And that as a result, we have this kind of mismatch that we're using essentially a motivational operating system, a set of assumptions and protocols that's really made for 20th century work, these if-then motivators, and applying them to 21st century work. And we have compatibility problems. And my suggestion is, if we, again, looking at the research, that we upgrade to a different approach to motivation, one that is far less reliant on if-then rewards, not on all rewards, but on a certain kind of reward, and that prizes other sorts of motivators, such as autonomy, mastery, and a sense of purpose.
Yeah, certainly those last three. Let's talk about those in a little more detail before we move on in more depth to looking at the more detail about the form of motivation that works and what doesn't work. Talk about those: autonomy, mastery, and the third one
is purpose.
Purpose. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, what it shows, I think what the research shows, again, as I read it, is, again, I don't want this to seem like it's a screed against rewards of all kind and a cry for everyone to do volunteer work and never be remunerated. That's not the point at all. The point is that if you look at the research, it shows, I think pretty clearly, that you got to pay people enough. That if you don't pay people enough, you're not going to get motivation. But once you pay people enough, and I would argue pay people more than enough, additional units of money have relatively little impact on additional units of performance or additional units of satisfaction. What seems to matter more are these other elements. Autonomy. Autonomy is essentially self-direction. And if you look at management as it's, we have this sort of misplaced notion of management. We think of it as something that emanated from nature or that was delivered to us from God, when in fact it's just something that some guy invented in the 1850s. And Gary Hamel has said this, it's a technology. It's a technology really for getting compliance. That's what it's for. And even if you sand off the rough edges, that's what the goal of management essentially is. My belief is that today you don't want compliance, you want engagement. And the way that people engage autonomously. People don't engage through coercion or monitoring. They engage through self-direction. And that requires providing people enormous amounts of autonomy over their time, over their time at work, over their task at work, over their technique, and even over their team. And there's some, I hope we can talk about them later, some really cool and interesting examples of companies around the world taking this very different approach to motivation through greater amounts of autonomy. That's one thing. Mastery. Mastery is our desire to get better at stuff because we like to get better at stuff. This is, why people play musical instruments on the weekend. That seems to be, in some sense, at least, it seems to be something of irrational behavior.
It's an undeniable deep source of satisfaction. Whether it's musical instruments, playing chess, crossword puzzles, climbing, rock climbing. I mean, it's just running.
But here's the thing. Here's what I find interesting about it. It doesn't make people any money. And I don't think
it depends. It depends what you're mastering.
Well, let's take playing. Most amateur musicians, by the nature of being amateurs, people practicing piano on the weekend or playing chess on the weekend, aren't going to make a lot of money out of it. I mean, it's as a rational calculation of how you make money. It's probably not they're better off doing something else. And it also, it's a curious question about whether it has any kind of biological explanation. But at least superficially, playing a musical instrument, playing the bassoon on the weekend or playing chess on the weekend isn't necessarily the optimal way to sate your hunger, slake your thirst, get your genes into the next generation.
Well, there's something else going on there. I agree.
And so...
but I would argue it's deeply innate within most people.
I agree.
So it's hard to understand. There isn't an obvious survival benefit, but presumably it may have had some survival benefit in the past that we don't know about.
I think that's very plausible.
Not the bassoon part, no.
No, I actually think that the evolutionary argument is more powerful than the economic argument.
Yeah.
And that now on the other hand, and I'm you're talking to someone who has a Charles Darwin doll in his office. Okay, so I am very comfortable with these evolutionary explanations. The trouble sometimes is that they can be a little bit too true, a little bit too neat.
Yeah,
that is, you can, gerrymander them to explain just about anything. But regardless, the point is that people do it. If we look at it just, in a slightly less, we're going to find the answer to this. People do it because they like it, because they get better at it, and that making progress is inherently satisfying. There's also some very interesting research by Teresa Amabile that's not in the book. Teresa Amabile, who's a business school professor at Harvard, that showed that the single most motivating thing at work was a sense of making progress. And so, mastery and making progress is inherently motivating. And finally, there's a sense of purpose. That is, people tend to perform better when they do what they do in the service of something larger than themselves, or at least when they see how it contributes to a larger whole. And there's actually some other new research that's not in the book, happy to talk about it, by a fellow at Wharton named Adam Grant, showing that if you sort of introduce purpose and context to a task, that people perform better on it. Even in the absence of any kind of purely economic incentive.
No doubt about it.
So again, I think autonomy, mastery, and purpose are more robust building blocks for true, enduring motivation, particularly for the complicated, conceptual, creative tasks. Now, that said, it doesn't mean that all rewards are bad. In fact, I actually try to divide up the categories to something that I might call that you call a now that reward, that is a little bit more unexpected, a little less, much less contingent. And I think that those kinds of rewards are less disruptive of a lot of the complicated conceptual creative work that I think that the purely contingent carrot and sticks can disrupt.
Well, to my surprise, though, you called the chapter about when it does work the special circumstances. As an economist, we tend to like incentives. So the book, to some extent, is a challenge to conventional economic thinking.
To some extent. I think to some extent. I mean, it wasn't meant, as you know, I'm not an economist. I think it's a challenge to conventional business practices in many cases. But, when again, and this is it's a very easy straw man to erect and knock down. Won't stop me from doing it.
There you go.
Which is that, this idea that And again, when I took economics, the idea was that at our core we are rational calculators of our economic self-interest, and we make decisions based on that. And it turns out that, and I know you're skeptical of some of the research in behavioral economics, that human beings aren't as uniformly rational as conventional economic theory would make us out to be.
I agree with that, and I think we'll talk in more detail about some of the research. It's certainly true, and I've said it many times here on the program, we care about a lot more than just money. It's also certainly true that the introduction of money into a non-monetary context can be jarring and counterproductive.
Right.
And as you argue in the book, a lot of it's not just that these monetary incentives are ineffective. Sometimes they're actually counterproductive, which is surprising and quite interesting. And I think sometimes it's true, and hope we can talk about when those are the case. But I think the real issue here, part of it is when economists talk about motivation, they use this little phrase, which I find unhelpful to non-economists, but economists all understand what it means, and that phrase is at the margin. And what we usually mean by that is, for example, talking about motivation, well, we're motivated by lots of things. Money, pride. Adam Smith understood this well in the theory of moral sentiments.
Absolutely.
We care about what others think of us. We care about our reputation. As you say, we care about a lot of subtle and really glorious things, autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Those are extremely important. No one wants to turn a crank for a great deal of money and if there's nothing on the other side of the crank. If you're desperately hungry, you might.
Right.
But if there's nothing on the other side of the crank, you're cranking, there's a crank on the wall and somebody pays you to crank it and you crank it for years and then you go on the other side of the wall and you find out it's not attached to anything. No one would say, oh, well, he got the money anyway. He doesn't care. So those are all important. The question is at the margin. That is, given a certain level of autonomy, mastery, and purpose, if you then add money to it, does that enhance it at the margin? That is, does a little more money make you try a little bit harder, or does it become counterproductive? Because again, I don't think the straw man part of these kind of arguments for me is the idea that says, oh, you just give people a bunch of money if they do their job and you just leave them alone. That's all you have to do. The money takes care of it. It's all incentives. That's bad management. It's the wrong way to run a company. I don't think many people run their company that way. The question is, how do you balance that delicate mix of autonomy, mastery, purpose, and money?
Yeah.
Because they all matter.
I think they absolutely do matter, and I think that the way you do it, I think that in some ways, and this harkens back a little bit to the work of Hertzberg 50 years ago, and the idea that some kinds of motivators are hygienic in a way, and that.
What does that mean?
Well, it means basically that if you don't pay people enough, you're not going to get motivation. That is, it has to sort of set a standard of hygiene, but whether hygiene is hygiene as fairness, hygiene.
It's a 1950s word.
Yeah.
Use of it. Well, you give the example, and I think it's a very good example of the dictator game, right? If you and I are dividing $10, and I say to you, I get to divide, you get to veto, we're okay. So I give you 2, and I keep 8. Well, you might say no, even though you're going to lose.
Right.
Lose both the $2 and for the thrill of giving me 0 for my arrogance, you might be willing to do that, and that surprised some economists. I think it's important to keep those in mind. The example you open with, which is phenomenal, which is Wikipedia outperformed Encarta, which would have been unexpected. Economists would have said, no, the people who are being paid to do this are going to do a better job. So,
and it's in some ways, almost theoretically impossible. I mean, if I had gone to I took my first economics course in 1983 with a professor at Northwestern University named Mary Alice Schulman, who was a terrific teacher. And if I had gone to her in 1983 and said, hey, let me run this business model past you, a bunch of people who don't know each other get together and decide to do work for free, and it will triumph over something created with the proper incentives by a well-funded, publicly held corporation.
Profit maximizing.
She would say, no.
Right.
I'm sorry. It'd be like going to my physics professor and saying, I'm going to throw a ball out the second-story window, and instead of it dropping to the ground, it's going to float into the air.
No, I agree. And I think when we look at that, think we're seeing the power of what I think of as play. It's the mix of autonomy. It's the mix of autonomy with mastery and purpose. We do lots of things for no money, right? It's what was surprising, I think, to economists, or would have been if you'd got on record with them, is that they wouldn't have thought of that as play in 1983.
Interesting.
But it is play for most. That's why, you and I blog for free.
Yeah.
Right? It's fun. It has some implicit financial return down the road, maybe.
Maybe, but it's tenuous. And if we were purely rational calculators, we could, we could probably come up with a way to say, okay, what is the net present value of this blogging that I'm doing?
Yeah, it looks like a loser.
Yeah, right. I mean, I might as well go, 3 blocks away to Chick-fil-A and work there.
Yeah. Well, I want to get back to the point you just made though, about Hertzberg. I'm sorry I derailed us. You use this phrase a lot in the book. You say, the pay has to be what an economist would call market-based. You have to get a decent pay relative to your alternatives. Although, of course, a lot of really fun jobs pay less than that because they're really fun. But in general, there's some level of basic compensation. If you don't meet, you're not going to get you're going to get bitterness and resentment. That's why I brought up the dictator game.
Right.
So, but here's my question. After you've done that, do you not believe that effort and shirking are affected by how much people are paid? Do you think are you against merit pay? Do you think everyone should make the same at that level of healthy amount, whatever that is, hygienic amount?
No, because I think that there have to be measures. There have to be accountability measures, and the fact that everybody should be treated well doesn't mean means that everybody has to be treated the same. And what I've seen is that, especially in the workplace, is that people are exquisitely attuned to the norm of fairness. It is more fair for someone who is a top producer, someone who is contributing more to the organization, contributing a lot to the organization, to make more than someone who isn't. My argument is that if you think that you can simply say whoever comes up with a great idea here gets $5,000 and that's going to lead to better performance, I think that part is mistaken.
I agree with that. I don't think that's
in the market,
common.
and there is it's interesting. I think that there is a market mechanism here in that our norm of fairness is determined by what someone in a similar situation, sort of, with my level of experience, my level of contribution, my level of ability, would be making at a comparable place. I think that's the standard that people use, and if you violate that norm, I think that you're in big trouble. I mean, I found it interesting. I didn't write very much about it. I wish I would have. Is the research that shows that these high performing companies pay more than the market clearing wage. That is, that what they're doing in some sense, to recast it in very much layman's term, is that they are paying people enough so that they're not focused on the money and they're focused on the work.
Yeah, of course, there's another interpretation, which is the threat of firing, the threat of losing your job is a motivator. And by overpaying, you use that carrot and stick rather than an explicit contractual one. You say if you don't,
so that the pain of loss is greater.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's both.
I think that is a very plausible, truly, that's a very plausible explanation, because if you look at the research on loss aversion, I find it pretty persuasive.
Yeah. I think it's probably a little of both, though. And I think you're right. Having just spent some time in Silicon Valley, that culture of both compensation, both monetary and non-monetary compensation, and the amount of flexibility that employees have, the amount of autonomy, I think is very high there. I was told, I don't know if this is true, that if you have a business in Palo Alto with more than 3 employees, you have to provide a shower for workers. And that's because they give them a chance to go biking during the middle of the day or running or whatever. Isn't that amazing?
Sounds like an urban legend, but
I think the person who told me is pretty reliable. I'll
wow,
check it. I'll check it.
That's quite remarkable, actually.
I'll check it when we put
quite
this out.
Remarkable.
But that's consistent with your story, right?
But let's go back. Let's go back directly to your point, which is your question really, which is on the margin. And does a little bit more money on the margin improve performance? And I think that the evidence is very unclear there. it depends on somehow it depends on how the money is distributed. I think that if you offer people, there's something of a sweet spot. So it depends on how much money. So if you say, if you do a little bit better by some kind of metric, I'll give you a $10 bonus at the end of the month. That is obviously not going to have any kind of effect. It might even have a negative effect. If you say to someone, if you hit your numbers at the end of the month, I'll give you a $100,000 bonus. I think that's very motivating.
You bet.
I think it's extraordinarily motivating. I think that for simple tasks, people are going to do. I think for many tasks in the short term, people are going to rise to the occasion and figure out any way possible to hit their number, even if it requires taking the low road.
Right, and they do sometimes, of course. So they do it, and they'll take the low road not just in legal ways, but just to hurt the company. Someone I was talking to about your book, who's in sales, told me that, sales bonus he finds very motivating. He works about 80 hours a week, and he said he'd rather work 40. But he said, of course, it leads to people reporting things sometimes that aren't true, which is why his company has a very good auditing process. He says that probably they spend more on than some of their helping their employees. But it's a mix. But
what's interesting about that is that it nominally improves performance, but it also exacts the costs. I mean, if they're spending extra money to police the system,
nothing's free.
Then its benefit obviously is less. Yep. The other thing for really kind of conceptual tasks, more sort of things that are purely conceptual. Anybody who comes up with a new product idea that works in the marketplace gets $100,000. I think that it is motivating in the sense that it will produce activity, that people will respond to that. I don't think there's any question about that. I think that they'll log a lot of hours. I'm not convinced at all that they're going to do anything more creative, more conceptually brilliant.
But Dan, that is the way our economy actually works, right? Our economy works by, if you do, forget within a company, if you're self-employed and you come up with a new product that's really successful, you get $100,000. You get more than $100,000, and it really is pretty powerful.
Right, but
it generates a lot of bad ideas,
right,
and a lot of entrepreneurs who are overconfident about their product, but that's how it works. They don't do it out of love, most of them. They do it out of love and money.
Yeah, although I actually think that for successful entrepreneurs, the balance between love and money tilts more toward love, and that in many cases, money operates in a slightly different way. That is, money operates as a form of feedback on whether they're doing that.
Yeah, no, I agree.
So if if you look at, say, my view, it's hard to prove. My view is that most entrepreneurs are not deeply greedy. Most successful entrepreneurs are not deeply greedy people.
No, I agree. It's to quote Bruce Yandel, who I quoted here before. He says, "I love my job, but if they didn't pay me, I wouldn't show up on Monday morning." Now, there's some jobs we love enough, like blogging. We show up even though they don't pay at all. Mm-hmm. Other jobs that are less pleasant, they don't have to pay very much, but they've got to pay something, like you say. They got to pay that base rate. But I think for entrepreneurs, again, it's the at the margin thing. I think, and I've written about this in The Price of Everything. I think most people are in it for those deep satisfactions that are not monetary, but the monetary is the signal. It's also the scorekeeper. Part of what we were talking about earlier, the innate drives, are competitiveness to do something well and then do it better, and do it better than not just that I did before, but better than somebody else does, which is what all of sports is about. It's a lot of what entrepreneurship is about.
Although I would argue that really that if you look at great athletes are, I think in some ways this notion of competition is a little, I think it's a little murkier. I think that if you look at great athletes are very much motivated by the desire to do better to do the best they can do, to do something extraordinary.
Mastery.
And that often has the consequence of besting your opponent. But I would say that great athletes tend to be extraordinarily intrinsically motivating, and a lot of the rewards that they get are a consequence of that. and that operate as a form of feedback on whether they're doing a good job. Let's go back to the margins here for a second. Think about someone who takes a company public and makes a lot of money, and then goes and starts another company. I mean, the marginal value of if they're multi-millionaires or billionaires, the marginal value of a little bit more money isn't all that great. So why do they go and start another company?
You tell me.
I think they do it because it's interesting, because
it's fun.
It's challenging.
It's true, but they'd rather start a company that makes a lot of money than one that doesn't.
Sure.
For all kinds of reasons.
Sure. I would too. Absolutely.
Yeah, right. So I think it's both. That's all. It's both. Well, let's talk about the some of the underlying research that you use in the book to challenge the carrot and stick approach, the if-then approach. There's been a lot of work done, and you go back quite a ways, some of which was neglected. Give us a little quick survey of that academic history and what some of the findings were.
Well, I mean, it goes back to the 1940s with a guy named Harry Harlow, who was, essentially did an experiment where he was training monkeys to figure out how to solve a puzzle, and it was going to reward them with raisins. And lo and behold, they start playing with the puzzles, messing with it. It goes back to your point about play. Playing with the puzzle and figuring it out in the absence of any kind of outside reward. And I think he was one of the first people to say, obviously primates of all kind, we have a biological drive. We have this reward and punishment drive. We do respond to external incentives. That is unequivocally true. But maybe we also have this other drive out there where we do things because they're inherently interesting. And so he was the first person to sort of introduce this, but that was a very controversial claim, especially in 1940s, 1950s psychology, which was all about rats in Skinner boxes.
Yeah.
And so he went another way, and he ended up being famous for other kinds of things. He ended up being controversial for some other kinds of things unrelated. And then, in the late 1960s, another group of psychologists began picking this up, in particular a guy named Edward Deasy at the University of Rochester, who did a series of experiments that showed something very surprising, which showed that introducing these kinds of external contingent rewards on something that people actually enjoy doing can actually extinguish their interest in doing it. The idea that if you take something inherently interesting that people like to do and you layer money on top of it, that would have an additive effect. And what his research found is that actually, no, it doesn't. It's almost like there's only room for one or another. Now, he's since refined his theory a little bit to make it a little bit less black and white. And so, among a whole range of psychologists, and then eventually a couple of sociologists, and then eventually a group of economists, mostly in the behavioral economist camp, they began kind of challenging some of the orthodoxy about what motivates people. And to my mind, bringing in a more three-dimensional view of human beings. And I think that three-dimensional view of human beings is actually absent in many sorts of companies, and to the company's detriment.
Let's talk about that research first, and then we'll talk about some of the applications. I'm interested in the corporate stuff, but I'm also interested very much in the educational part, because there's been some very novel and controversial attempts to apply this kind of work to education.
Right.
But let's talk about the research, because what I found fascinating about
I know you're skeptical of some of this research, so just don't hold back. Express your skepticism. We'll talk about it.
Yeah. I have two types of skepticism. There's two types of. One is the nature of the research, and the second is sometimes the interpretation.
Okay.
So let's talk about.
Otherwise, you're
it's great.
A big fan.
No, I'm in. The first one, for example, which you describe in some detail, is the study by Ariely and some of his colleagues in India, and it was a very clever study, because the advantage of doing it in a poor country is that the rewards can be fairly large without bankrupting the budget of the researchers.
Right.
So talk about what they did, and then I'll give you my skepticism, and you can respond.
Okay. Well, I mean, essentially what they did is that they offered, and I thought it was actually a pretty ingenious methodology. So because it's basically let's offer up rewards for performance that are meaningful. So if you were to offer me, I'll give you $5 to jump over the table, that's probably not sufficiently arousing for me.
Yep.
But if you were to say, I'll give you $5,000, well,
think about
then
it.
you have my attention.
$5 million, I'm really going to get your attention.
$5 million, I'm going to, you got it. So, so what they did is they had people do a series of tasks, some of them involving physical capability, some of them involving cognitive capability. So the physical thing, I think, was throwing a ball through a hoop, something like that. And then the cognitive capabilities were, I don't remember specifically what they were, but it's sort of a range of cognitive tasks.
Well, one was repeating a long number, a many-digited, I think it was nine, a
sort of
nine-digit
memorization on one level, and then maybe somewhat more conceptually complicated tasks. And what they found pretty clearly is that when the tasks called for only mechanical, and then they offered three different levels of reward: a small reward, a medium reward, and a large reward. And the small reward was something like
still pretty big. It was a half a day.
The small reward was maybe the equivalent of 2 weeks' salary.
No, I think the smallest one was like a half a day's salary. Then it was 2 weeks, and the large reward was 5 months.
Several months of salary.
Yeah, it was massive compared to the other two.
So 5 months. I think it was two. I think it was more. Anyway, two. It was small, medium, and large, but it ratcheted up pretty significantly. So it was a meaningful amount. I mean, if you were to say, I'm going to give you 5 months' salary for high performance, that gets anybody's attention in any sort of country.
Agreed.
And what they found is that when the task required sort of mechanical skill, bonuses worked more or less as they expected. That the higher the pay, the better the performance. But once you got to any kind of conceptual skill, a higher reward often led to worse performance, and there was also evidence that the most incentivized people performed the worst of all,
which is very surprising.
Right.
And that was very cool. And it wasn't just it was statistically significant. It was actually a pretty large difference in, if I remember, in the performance. It wasn't just it was worse, which would be surprising. It was dramatically worse.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, so give me the Roberts interpretation of that.
Well,
now one way to interpret that obviously is to say, and this is the way that Ariely and others interpreted it in part, is that although I thought they were actually fairly cautious in over-interpreting it, as I remember the paper, which I haven't read for several months, but as I remember the paper, and said, that the idea that higher rewards lead to better performance isn't uniformly true, and that in many cases it can work in the exact opposite fashion. So but the Roberts interpretation is.
Well, here's why I'm skeptical. I'm not skeptical. Well, I don't know if I should be skeptical of the results. I'm skeptical of the interpretation.
Yeah, right, of course.
So here's I wouldn't just say of course, because sometimes I always wonder whether these results could be replicated. If you did it again,
interesting.
and
Okay,
they didn't find it, they wouldn't have published it. It wouldn't have been interesting, right? If suppose they'd found. They tried 3 different tasks, and some of them, and they all worked the way, quote, conventional thinking would have suggested. The higher they paid, the better results they got. Well, you can't publish that paper, so they throw that result out. So you have to always be careful. I
think that's a problem. That's an alarm bell with academic research in general.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's not only true in economics. That's true in
every field.
In medicine.
Absolutely, it's a huge problem in research.
Right. I mean. Yeah, it'd be interesting to check the hard drives and electronic trash bins.
I want to follow them around. I want to say, okay, how many times did you do it?
I'm absolutely with you on that. And you also see this. I don't mean to derail your point.
No, that's all right. We'll come back.
But I have seen this in terms of, with friends of mine. I just remember this from 20 years ago when friends of mine were in graduate school. And and this is true in the, I'm thinking about friends of mine in, say, the biological sciences or chemistry or those sorts of things, where, they were working under the thumb of the great master, and they were carrying out some of these experiments, and they knew that, it was if they came up with results that weren't, a senior scientist or a senior researcher would assign 3 graduate students to carry out the same experiment. And then when one came back with the results that he didn't want, he would say, okay, whatever. Another came back with the results he didn't want, okay, whatever. And the one came back with the results he did want, all right, we're going to go with that.
Yeah.
And it ended up actually affecting the careers of people.
Yeah, no, it's a horrible problem.
Yeah, anyway, so it's a bigger issue altogether. But go ahead.
It's a version of confirmation bias. It's called publication bias, but it's a huge problem. But let's put that to the side. Yeah. What I found disappointing about that is that where I would expect rewards to be perverse and interesting would be in a case where effort mattered. So let me give you the contrast with what they did versus what I think would have been more applicable. Now, I'm a mediocre golfer. Mm-hmm. I'm one of the greatest golfers in the world who's golfed fewer than 50 times, but I'm a horrible golfer. Mm-hmm. But I can sink a 10-foot putt every once in a while, maybe pretty often. Mm-hmm. But if you put me in front of a 10-foot putt and said, if you make this, I will give you $2 million, or if you miss this, I will sever the hand of your child. Mm-hmm. I don't think I'd be very good at it. That would induce, those large rewards or punishments would induce fear, and anxiety would make it more difficult for me to do the task. So if I'm trying to memorize a 9-digit number and I know that I can get 5 months' salary, maybe I'll do worse than if it's just a little pleasant bonus.
Right.
We come back to your earlier point. When you think about autonomy, I think it's great that workers are autonomous, but we know that autonomous workers often surf the internet for their own purposes. So too much autonomy, not so good if it's not directed toward the goal of the company. And shirking is usually a problem, even in well-intentioned organizations.
Yeah, of course.
Nonprofits, people who are fighting for a cause.
Of course.
So my challenge to the Ariely, it's not your study, but the Ariely study is that it's not the right experiment. The right experiment would be something where you've got 3 months to work on something and you've got to trade off working hard versus not working hard. Mm-hmm. I think rewards are really important.
Interesting. I think that's interesting. So let's unpack that for a little bit. So
go ahead.
So the interpretation that you would put on that is that a reward of those high stakes. A reward of, I think you're making 2 points. The reward with stakes that high is performance impairing because it induces anxiety.
And I don't have a mechanism. It's not like I can try harder to memorize a 9-digit number. I either have a gift at it or I don't. I only have the fear part. If you gave me a chance to go do some research or to practice, find a mnemonic to help me remember it, I bet people...
I guess the 2 points are twin. One of them is that the size of the reward induces anxiety. The other one is that the task itself is not particularly similar to the tasks that people actually do at work.
That's a better way to say it.
Which is not where things are often not a one-shot sink a putt or a slice off your finger, but require time, collaboration, and some degree of effort. Yeah. I think that's actually a fair point. I think one of the things, though, is that, and forgive me because I can't think of the name of it, but there is this thing in social science, and forgive me, I just cannot think of the name of it. It's essentially a curve that shows that certain kinds of stimulation, if there's not enough stimulation, people don't do anything, and if there's too much, people get freaked out by being overstimulated, and that there's a sweet spot along the curve. Is it Yerkes Dodson?
I don't know.
Something like that. In any event, I think that's true. I think that's a reasonable point. But essentially, that's in some ways what I'm saying is that a situation where someone has 3 months to complete a project. I think that hiring the right people and giving them the tools that they need and the freedoms they need to do a great job, and paying them a healthy salary so that they're focused on the task, not on how they can get the money, is a better management approach. Now, I think there's a norm of fairness. If somebody does come up with something in a collaborative, long-term way that ends up enriching the company, I think the norm of fairness says absolutely share the profits. But I think that the idea that I'm just skeptical of the claim that you say, hey, if you come up with a great idea after these, if you come up with something, if you do a great job over the next 3 months, I'll give you 6 months' salary, is necessarily going to lead to better performance. I'm very skeptical of that claim.
Well, and let me agree with you to make sure I don't push my skepticism too far. Yeah. Nobody likes to feel like the mouse in the experiment. No one likes to feel like a serf who serves the master at the master's benevolence, even when there's a lot of cash involved. It takes a lot of the fun out of the job. And you give a great example in the book of the ex post reward, the unexpected reward. The employee who comes up with the great new product or the new solution, you gave an example where it was small, and then a small contribution, they got a nice lunch or something, and that's a semi-monetary reward, I think. Yeah. But you're right. I think rewarding an employee unexpected with any kind of, whether it's praise or compensation in monetary forms, after the fact, has the advantage of letting the bonus be adjustable, which also makes the work effort more open-ended as well.
That's a good point.
Right. So I think I'd be fascinated to know how Apple treats its top engineers. I suspect.
Very good question, yeah.
I suspect the ones who make the largest contributions, to the extent it's knowable, sometimes it's not, which is a whole separate issue, which is also, I think, relevant for your point about how people are treated. If to the extent that it's knowable who makes the largest contribution to the iPhone, the iPad, et cetera, I bet those folks get a bonus, but it's just not written in stone in advance, which I think does tend to discourage productivity.
Well, I think that's a very, very interesting point that I didn't write about it and I hadn't considered. Is the open-endedness has some kind of advantage? That if people know that if people know that the company treats people fairly and that good performance actually is rewarded, and I don't think most people in the workplace expect individuals to be treated exactly the same or to be paid exactly the same.
Right.
And if you see this in professional sports, where if you look at, say, my family are like the 5 of the 15 Washington Nationals fans in America.
Good times are coming, my friend.
Oh, heck yeah.
Bryce Harper. Oh, boy.
I hope so.
Feeling good about that.
I hope so. But if you look at, say, professional baseball team, people don't get paid the same amount.
And interestingly,
and they know what someone else is getting paid.
And while it's true that there are performance clauses in contracts, they're not common. The reward is basically your next contract. It's the
Yeah. Although what's interesting, Russ, is that there actually is, and forgive me, I cannot think of who's done this. So take it with a grain of salt, because I'm going to paraphrase something that I can't quite remember, but I think that the 1% of it is that, and it actually sort of supports your point about the power of incentives, is when baseball players are in the year before they become free agents.
Yeah, sure.
They actually post better numbers, once you control for other kinds of things.
Yeah, they try harder, even though you'd think the part that's weird about sports, I'm always skeptical of this, the coach gave them a great talk and they tried harder. Yeah. They're professionals.
Yeah.
Aren't they trying as hard as they can? And of course the answer is
not always.
Not always.
Yeah.
In basketball in the NBA, it's
a long season.
Yeah. Same with baseball, right?
It's a longer season.
Yeah.
And the point is that in the year before free agency, controlling for other sorts of factors,
I bet that's true.
People did a little bit better. But what's interesting is that, again, controlling for other things, their teams didn't do any better.
Yeah, although that's hard to measure, but yeah.
Yeah. So that so arguably. I think there's an inherent murkiness here, because
that's a great example, because it's possible they were just going for flashier forms of success to make their contract look better, but that assumes that the next general manager didn't realize that. And baseball's
But I
gotten
mean,
a little
do
more
they?
sophisticated.
But again, I mean, the next general manager is looking at say the aggregate numbers. They're not saying. They're not saying, God, I remember, there's no statistical measure of unwillingness to advance a runner with a sacrifice.
Well, it's not, with Manny Ramirez, there is. He doesn't run he won't run out of ground balls. But
right. I think that a lot of this, and it's interesting about sort of the nature of human beings, and it goes back to the ultimatum game. Is I have found, and again, I haven't looked at a lot of research on this, is that people are very, very well tuned to fairness.
Yeah, no doubt about it.
And I think that's one reason. If you look at, say, public reaction to salaries and things, particularly executive salaries, is that people, you look at somebody like a Bob Nardelli. I mean, at least forgive me for naming names, but here it's not fair. So if you're the CEO of a large company, of a large publicly held company, and your company does really well, at least in stock performance, you get a lot of money. I don't think most people have a problem with that.
Yeah, I agree.
The problem is that if you're the CEO of a publicly held company and you run your company into the ground, you make a lot of money.
Of course, it's true of baseball players too. It's a weird thing, and people do get mad about it. Of course,
they do get mad about it, but no one gets mad about Steve Jobs making a lot of money, or Jeff Bezos making a lot of money, or those folks, because it seems fair. They created something, they did something. I just think that what I think is really interesting about people's reaction, especially to money and compensation, is how much the norm of fairness seems to be what prevails.
Yeah, no, I think it's very important, and I suspect there's some cultural differences there about what's fair.
I'm sure there is. I don't know that makes intuitive sense. But anyway, go on. I mean, I know you want to talk about some other research.
Yeah, I want to talk about that one other piece of research, and then I want to get to the education and make sure we get to that. There's a fascinating study which I found extremely interesting, and I like a lot of it, by the way. I'm not a total skeptic on this one, which is the Israeli Daycare Center study, which I've seen referenced in other contexts, interestingly. So in this, tell what happened in that. It's a great example.
The gist of it was you had this group of Israeli daycare centers, and they had a rule at the daycare center where parents had to pick up their kids by 4 p.m. If they didn't pick up their kid by 4 p.m., the caregiver had to stay late. And they noticed most parents were complying with the rule, but they noticed some parents were coming late, and so to deter them from showing up late, they imposed a fine, which makes perfect sense. You want less of behavior, you deter it, but with a punishment. And so they posted this sign that said, there's a fine for coming late. Everybody knows the rule. If you show up past a certain time, you're going to get imposed. You have a fine being imposed on you. And it was a very modest fine. It was
$3, I think.
Yeah,
equivalent of $3,
just a few dollars. And after the imposition of the fine, they noticed there was an increase in the number of parents coming late. So here you had this disincentive, this punishment, this fine for showing up late, and it ended up doubling the incidence of lateness.
The reason I like that, the reason I find it so fascinating, and it's such a good example, because it took a situation where there was no monetary role being played,
right, and
introduced one. And one of the things I think your book makes one think about, which I find fascinating, is that money is weird, especially when you go from no money to money. So in that case, there was a Hayekian emergent cultural norm that said it's not nice to come at 4:05, and it's really not nice to come at 4:20 because you impose costs on others against their will, and it's mean. So most people don't do it, but there's a few people who aren't so nice, and they abuse it. They take advantage of it. They free ride. You can call them. Sometimes they enjoy it. They think, that sucker's waiting at 4:15 for me, and I get to go run my errand.
Yeah.
I'm getting a deal. So a lot of people think that way in life,
well,
but not too many.
Not too many,
which is what's great.
Some of them are people we call sociopaths. But go ahead.
And some of them, they just made a mistake. They thought they were going to get there at 4.
Yeah.
They're just not good at time, and we know a lot of people like that.
Yeah. Okay.
Either of us might be one of those people. So that is a fascinating thing. So there was a cost before the change in policy. The cost was shame, embarrassment.
And you also inconvenience another person, and not just any person, but the person who was caring for your
kids. Yeah. So, as you say, people are sociopaths. What we mean by that is they enjoy breaking the norm. They get pleasure from exploiting a person who expects them to do the right thing and then they don't do it. So when you change from that system to a system that says, if you violate the rule, it's $3, well, $3 is cheap, maybe, relative to shame, and you say, oh, that's all it costs? They're going to let me do it for $3? So it was interesting. I was talking to a friend about this. Again, I think it's a great, interesting example. He said, well, in the daycare center I go to, I take my kids to, it's $1 a minute. Mm-hmm. That's pretty effective. Now, you might say, some people might say it's, in that case, you won't be, people won't be showing up a half an hour late. But you still, even in that case, of course, you could get it increase. But then if you made it $5 a minute or $20 a minute, there is some amount that would substitute for the shame. Of course, you might lose some customers too because they say, I'm just not good at time. I don't like paying the fine. Right? So it's a great example.
I think that you have, but I mean, I think that's right. I think that the $3 or $4, whatever it was, it might have been mispricing. However, I think the example is less. I love this. I love this study for a couple of reasons because we tend to think that if you punish behavior, you'll get less of it, and that just isn't universally true, as this study shows. However, I think the other thing that it shows is that, and the point that these folks are making is that if you take something that is sort of operates in the moral realm, or which I think this did, and put a price on it. You export it from the moral realm to the economic realm. That's not an inherently bad thing, but it abides by a very different set of rules.
Totally agree with that.
And so it becomes like buying a bag of Cheetos. You're buying time, and so you've extinguished all of the moral, social responsibility for that. And it's just, if you want more time, you just buy it. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong about that. However, I think if you impose, let's say, $5 a minute for picking up your kid, I think that would deter people. However, I think it would exact other sorts of costs.
I agree, because I think some people would say this is too. It makes me too nervous. I can't handle it.
I think you would have people exit, but I also think that you would have litigation. I mean it.
You're right, because you got to have a stopwatch that's reliable.
Yeah, imagine this. It's like, okay, I got three. Or what did you have? 4 kids?
I have 4 kids.
4 kids. Okay, I got 3 kids. So let's say it's $5 a minute per kid, and I pick up my kid, and I got to pick up my kid at 4 o'clock.
It's 4:02.
Okay,
yeah.
I got to pick up my kid at 4 o'clock, and so it's $5 a minute. I show up at 4:01. All right, and so $5 a minute, 3 kids, $15. Okay, I go in there and they say, Mr. Pink, I'm sorry, you owe us $15 to pick up your 3 kids. And I look at my watch and say,
$3.59. Yeah.
Excuse me, my watch says it's $3.59. Whose watch are we going to use to arbitrate this dispute?
Which is exactly why the what I would call the textbook economics incentives of $3 a minute or a meter on the restaurant table for lingering over your meal. Those are not the ways that effective businesses handle these problems. No. They use the upraised eyebrow, the disdainful look, and they use shame. And I agree with.
And I think that you're right, though. I think that the if we're searching for what's the perfect solution to this problem, it doesn't exist.
Right.
Because I think in the one case you're going to have in the first case you're going to have the sociopaths who revel in inconveniencing other people, or who smirk at the raised eyebrow because they know that they're inconveniencing someone. In the other scenario, I think what you're going to have is you need a much greater administrative apparatus.
Agreed.
To deal with this, to take my call when it's 3:55 and saying, hey, a tree fell on the Beltway. I've never been late before. This is an act of God. This is force majeure. You can't possibly charge.
Exactly.
And I think that's what I love about this study is that it shows, okay, wait a second, this is complicated.
Yeah, no, I agree, and that's why I like it too.
Complicated, and but I do, and in the title of the paper, if I'm not mistaken, I don't have it right in front of me, is a fine is a price,
which means you can buy if you want.
Yeah, but it also shows that in this particular scenario, the price wasn't high enough.
Yeah, but your point I think is really right, which is that if you made it higher, you might have unintended consequences. And again, to push the Hayekian line, I think businesses use, and families and social environments use all kinds of signals besides money And sometimes money's the best, but not always. Sometimes other ways are better.
Well, there's a very interesting. I mean, I think that the Hayekian order will emerge principle takes place inside of companies too. I just happened to
Absolutely.
write about something very interesting. I thought was interesting, which is about Netflix, and inside of its corporate headquarters, it doesn't have a vacation policy. You can take as much vacation as you want anytime you want it.
Fascinating.
Now, obviously, you're going to have some people. There are going to be one or two people who are going to be free riders, or who are going to be
for a while,
unless they get canned and or ostracized from the. But there isn't abuse within that culture. It isn't saying I'm going to take out for 6 months and not do any work, because there is this emergent order and set of culture and values that has nothing to do with money.
Oh, in one way, that the modern workplace overwhelmingly, by dispensing with the time clock, has sort of made all of us autonomous that way, right? I'm lucky. I have a very extremely autonomous job as a professor. You're self-employed,
right?
You have the similar level of autonomy. But if you work at Google or Microsoft or GM, and not on the line, but in the white collar part, it work in an enormous number of companies. You can get up and wander off and go run an errand, unless you're expected for a conference call at 10 a.m. No one says, "Where's Bob?"
Yeah, although I think there actually is more of that sort of vestigial time clockiness, outside of places like Google or Microsoft.
Yeah, there's some.
Yeah,
but as the other part, of course, is that there's a tyranny potentially there. A culture can emerge in that situation where everybody's competing to show how loyal they are to the company by never taking a vacation day. So it'd be interesting to see how that, again, there's going to be an emergent result. I'm not sure whether it'd be 2 weeks a year, the occasional day.
Interesting. Yeah, that'd be fascinating to see. My hunch on this is that people would look to see what the CEO or the very, very top people do.
Yeah.
And that the result, and if they were the first mover on that if the CEO took 3 weeks or something, then you'd have people taking 3 weeks plus or minus something.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. That's very cool. Let's get to the educational applications, because my wife teaches high school math, and she thinks a lot about this. And one of the voices in education that, as I mentioned in the beginning, is controversial is Alfie Kohn. So Alfie Kohn has a book called Punished by Rewards.
And several other books. Yeah,
but the one that title is a beautiful summary of his worldview, Punished by Rewards. The idea that by rewarding people for doing things such as learning, we're actually hurting them. So talk about that. What's the argument there, and what are the implications for education? It's similar to the argument in the corporate sector too.
Yeah. I mean, I don't completely buy that argument. I think that there are situations where rewards can be pretty effective. I think that in schools in general, though he's largely right, that if you focus a kid, this is true if, let's say, paying for grades or paying for standardized test scores, I think that is mostly a bad idea. And some of the recent evidence that has come out, although to me it hasn't been reported this way. If you look at, I don't know if you've seen this paper by Roland Fryer that came out 2 months ago.
I've seen his earlier work. I haven't seen the latest.
He did a study of 4 school districts that were using monetary rewards for academic achievement. Chicago, New York, Washington, and Dallas. And in the 2 most expensive ones, where Chicago and New York, they were paying kids. They said, if you get an A or if you do well on a standardized test, you get, $100, $200. This paper showed, and Fryer is very, very open and honest about this, even though he's an advocate of these sorts of things, said flatly, these did not work. There was no effect. What was interesting, and I actually think, here is where I think that he misinterpreted the results. he took results. Now, Washington in Dallas, the rewards were basically not paying people for outcomes, but paying people for behaviors.
Interesting.
If you come to class, if you turn in your homework,
right.
that sort of stuff.
Not so good.
Well, no, that actually, according to him,
that worked better.
That worked better.
Really?
Because, and he was going. And his argument is that people didn't have the capacity or the social capital to figure out how to get an A.
So you had to,
even if they might have wanted it. Whereas they know how to show up to school.
Yeah.
And now I take issue with that. And there was also one, and I think the most interesting one, I thought was very interesting, was the results in Washington. This has been tried here in Washington, D.C., as you know, and the results in Washington that he showed, I think, are murky at best. I mean, even, before you impose the controls, there was actually a negative correlation between paying and doing these behaviors. Mm-hmm. And even he says in the paper that was his words, troubling. There are also problems. So I think that the results in Washington are inconclusive. The one area, I think this is very interesting, the one place where there were very robust results was in Dallas. And what Dallas did is it had this scheme where it paid second graders $1 for reading a book. Every book you read, you got $1. And then at the end of the year, there was a clear rise in reading scores.
Interesting.
Very robust effect.
How did they check whether people actually read the book?
They gave them a quiz at the end.
Yeah, that makes sense.
They had a set of books that were sort of a circumscribed but very large universe of books that you were allowed to read, but very large. And all of them came with a kind of computerized quiz to test whether they actually read the book.
Well, see, it's kind of grotesque, right?
But here's where I think, here's where it's interesting, and I'll let you can determine the level of grotesqueness.
Go ahead.
But I think what was clear about this is that there were results. There was no question about it. I mean, I can't remember, but it was very clear. It seemed to work. I think what's interesting about that, in contrast to these other ones, I think there are a few interesting things about it. Number one is that they were paying kids $1 a book. If I remember right, most kids read maybe 15 books. They paid the kids in 3 times a year, and they paid them with a check. Now, I think that's fascinating in itself because, these are second graders. I got a second grader in my house. And in fact, I'm surprised that you haven't heard him in this conversation. And I don't think my son knows what a check is.
Yeah, no, that's kind of weird.
He knows what cash is. There's no question about that.
Right.
But I don't think he knows what a check is. And so the one area where these contingent rewards, money rewards, cash rewards for performance worked was when in the youngest group of kids. Okay. So the rest of them were like high school age kids. These were second graders. The one area where money worked was where the kids were younger, and at least to my mind, the way the money was distributed, the money was less salient.
Yeah, that's weird. That's fascinating.
And but the results were very strong. And I think what it was is that what the schools did is saying, hey, it's reading year, we're going to read books, and you get $1, and they kind of gin kids up and made it an exciting, fun thing to do.
Yeah, there was some hoopla around it, for
which
sure.
Which you could probably do without the money. And so the one area one of these 4 experiments that he talked about, I mean, they were natural, they were field experiments. There were things happening in public school systems in 4 cities in America. The one area where it produced very strong results was the area where it was cheapest, the cheapest one by orders of magnitude.
Yeah, right, yeah.
I mean, this was the Dallas thing was like the total cost was something like $50,000, where in New York and Chicago, I think the total of those were like $3 million apiece. And
in one case, it was just a teacher. The other was an administrator. I mean, it was really expensive. Sorry.
I'm skeptical about that. Now, the one thing where I hold out some possibility is that I think it could be possible that if you take a kid whose life circumstances are so dire, who's had so few advantages, who begins the world in a position just not similarly situated to your kids or my kids, just sort of behind from the get-go because of the kid's misfortune of having the wrong parents and being born in the wrong neighborhood, that there might be a way that that some of these external things could sort of, kickstart an interest in learning.
Yeah, and I think that's what's.
And that strikes me as plausible, although I haven't yet seen it.
No, I think that's plausible. I think let's move away from money for a minute, because I think the Alfie Kohn part, and this gets entangled with some of your work on compensation and incentives and Motivation 2.0 versus other more modern, potentially effective ways, is he doesn't even like praise, because he argues. I've taught for 30 years, and I teach college students, but I have kids in my house, 4 kids, and you've seen this, I'm sure, with your kids. A great teacher can motivate kids it's a weird thing, just because the kids want to please the teacher, right? But not every teacher. There are other teachers, they want to please the teacher, but they want to hurt the teacher. They're going to show them that they're not going to learn, that they're a lousy teacher, right? So we understand that and this is true of adults too, by the way. It's not just for kids. That we want to please other people. We want their, this is again a Smithian point, we want their respect and their praise. And what Alfie Kohn argues, I think, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it is related to some of your work. What Alfie Kohn argues is that any kind of reward, whether it's monetary or whether it's non-monetary in the form of praise or points or grades, that's all going to hurt the intrinsic motivation. Replace it with extrinsic, and when those rewards disappear, the behavior disappears. And I look at it and I say, well, wait a minute. If I motivate a kid to try reading who's never read before, yeah, sure, they might only be doing it for the money at first, but isn't it possible, as you just said, that they'd learn to like reading? Even though they're, quote, only doing it for the money initially, might they not continue reading?
It's possible. It really depends on the circumstances. I mean, I think that at some level, I agree with him in part, and I disagree with him in part. If I take a 9-year-old kid and say he's not reading enough, so I'm going to pay him $1 for every book that he reads, as a parent. Okay, forget about it as education policy. As a parent,
I'm going to give my kid an iPod if he reads. Shakespeare.
I actually don't like that at all.
I think that.
Well, I'll tell you why. Because I think if you give a kid $1 book to read a book, or $2 a book to read a book, I think that kid is absolutely going to read in the short term.
Yeah,
I don't have any question about that. I think the kid's going to read short books.
Yeah,
I think he or she is not going to read particularly challenging books, but I think it'll work. I also think what you've done is you said reading is sort of like working at a fast food restaurant. It's something that only a chump would do for free. And so I actually think that he's right in that regard. But that doesn't mean that any kind of reward from an external source is inherently dehumanizing, and that's really his point. I mean, he has essentially a philosophical point that rewards from other people by their very nature dehumanize other people. And I just don't think that's empirically true. And if you look at let's take praise for instance, all right? I think praise is important. I think that the way you praise is really important.
Agreed.
And if you look at the research of, and this is true, I'm going to speak from the perspective of a parent. If you look at the research of Carol Dweck, the psychologist now at Stanford, what seems very clear from her research, and I've tried to do this as a parent very much, in part because my parents did the exact opposite. Is if you praise for effort and strategy, and not for innate qualities,
and not for results necessarily.
Not necessarily for results, but not necessarily not for results.
Correct. No. But if a kid tries really hard and doesn't make it, you don't say you're a loser. You better try harder the next time. You say, great effort. Maybe next time you'll do better.
What strategy did you use, and how can you improve that strategy? So if you look at a kid, and I'll speak from. This is very salient for me because. I've got a 13-year-old and an 11-year-old, but we've also got and we've got this little guy, the 7-year-old, and he has become something clicked in his head about math. That math isn't something you do in school. That math is actually a way to understand the world.
Cool.
All right, it's very cool.
That's a good thing.
And he's proven to be very good at it in his own way. And so, but instead of saying to him, We were trying to, sort of, he likes to do the puzzle. So he's like, give me a math problem. So I'll give him a math problem. And instead of saying, if he gets it right, oh, wow, you're so smart, you're so good at math, you say, oh, tell me the strategy you used on that. Well, I counted by tens rather than trying to multiply it. I said, well, that's a great strategy. That's a really good way to do it. That's awesome, the way you came up with that way to approach the problem. That is praise. I think that is motivating. I think it's healthy for a kid.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
I think that, and what Carol Dweck's research shows is that, if you praise a kid, if I were to take my kid right now, who, at age 7, and say, oh, wow, you're so good at math. Wow, you're so good at math. You're such a mathematician. What Carol Dweck's research shows is that the kid ends up, human beings can end up having a kind of this idea that effort doesn't matter.
This innate quality. Yeah.
That it's all about innate. It's all about innate quality, and that you either have it or you don't. And as a result, you're less likely to make an effort. And in her view, and I agree with her entirely. I mean, I think that effort itself is ennobling. That effort is a glorious thing in and of itself. And so, if you praise strategy and effort rather than innate qualities, I think that is not only not harmful, I think it's resolutely positive. And
it serves you well down the road. There's no doubt about it. I think the challenge in that setting is the kid who's not so good at math, who, and the other mistake we make, say, well, you're just not a math person.
I hate that.
Right? It's a destructive thing. Of course, sometimes they probably shouldn't plan a career in nuclear engineering or whatever the high application of mathematics is. But what I think is gloriously rewarding for a great math teacher is the ability to take average students and give them a sense of mastery. If you tell them they're bad at math,
absolutely,
and they have to try really hard, they're not going to get there. But and you might have to reward them at least with praise. You do have to give them some carrot. You and I agree that the monetary carrot might be very destructive and unpleasant, but the non-monetary carrot of praise, I think, is very potentially effective in that setting.
If you praise effort and strategy rather than the innate ability, so you don't say, "Wow,
correct,
that was really good. It's amazing you did that, even though you're so crappy at math."
Yeah,
I don't think that's effective. But I think if you take somebody who is maybe even a kid struggling with math and say, "Okay, try to solve this problem," and they'll say they don't get it right. Well, tell me what you did to try to solve it. Okay, that's a pretty good strategy. Now, what if we did it? What if we did it this way? And then, actually, I think for that sort of thing, showing kids progress is really important. So, shining a light on the progress, saying, remember, Charlie, 5 months ago you were really struggling with long division, and now you can do it pretty well. That's good. Way to go.
Yeah, that's awesome. And
I mean, it's hard for me to imagine how that could be destructive.
Yeah, and I think where that comes into play, one place that comes into play is homework. And again, I don't understand it, but there are a lot of people who argue there shouldn't be homework. Kids should just learn for the intrinsic love of the field. But if they're not good at it, they don't get much fun. It's not play. And I interviewed Daniel Willingham here, where we talked about the sweet spot of education, which is if it seems impossible, the kid shuts down.
Yeah.
If it's really easy, they shut down, because that's no fun either. You got to find it's challenging, but you can do it.
Right. Well, I'm not a big fan of homework because I think most homework is inane, it doesn't hit that sweet spot. And so, for some kids it's too easy, and for some kids it's too hard, and no one's really learning.
Yeah.
My daughter had a math teacher. Our middle daughter, Eliza, had a math teacher who came up with something brilliant, which he says he doesn't call. First of all, what he does is he gives kids different homework. Okay.
Yeah.
So, my daughter isn't getting the same homework as her classmate Fred or her classmate Maria.
Good idea. If you can do it. That takes a lot of devotion.
Exactly. It's hard work. And the other thing that he does is he doesn't call it homework, he calls it home learning.
That's smart.
And I even think that that semantic move is very helpful. But I think that I don't think there's anything inherently bad about homework per se. I think that most homework, though, is absolutely inane and is done more out of inertia than a sort of thoughtful way to help kid build his or her capacities or master a complicated subject. But again, as a this idea of going back to this, if homework is a way to help kids practice and exert effort and see a connection between effort and outcome, I think that's a glorious thing. But I think most homework is not that way.
Yeah, I'm afraid you're probably right. Well, we're out of time, but I want to give you one more chance to come back and talk about more back to the book. Talk about where you've done a lot of interesting work on the workplace, and this is just another piece in it. Here you're talking about compensation. In your previous books, you looked at the mix of self-employment versus corporate top-down employment. In your other book in between there, you looked at right brain versus left brain and the increasing use of creativity. So there's a nice story to tell there. In all three of those books kind of work together. So why don't you sum up where you sort of see the U.S. workplace going in all three of those modes?
Well, I mean, I think that there are a lot of things going on, and that I think that the nature of work, both particularly what people do and how they do it, is in its own way becoming more human. I think that people are looking to their work as a source of meaning, as a source of inherent satisfaction, and I think work is increasingly calling on higher level skills, and I think that's a good thing. This is why I express some skepticism over people thinking of people working long hours as a bad thing. I think there are many people who work long hours because they like to work and they like what they're doing. And so this idea that work is somehow inherently a kind of disutility is mistaken. And I just saw some new research today that shows how much happier people are when they're active rather than when they're idle. Even though we tend to think that being idle, not having to do anything, being completely free with any kind of obligation is the ideal state. In fact, actually being active and engaged and involved in something are the sources of highest human experience. So I think that work is becoming ever more human. And I think that the yearning to do something that matters and to do it in a way that is self-directed is a deep part of what it is to be human. My one concern is that the nature of organizations are often incompatible with that. And I think some organizations are changing, but I think it's very slow. And just to make one more point here about sort of the deep human yearnings that people have, and I think it connects the dots in some ways between this first book, Free Agent Nation, and this latest book, Drive. In that book, Free Agent Nation, which is about the rise of people working for themselves, and I'm happy to say that the book remains in print. It sells tens of copies every year.
But the phenomenon remains important.
Well, what's interesting is that to research that book, I traveled around the United States and I did these long interviews with people who had left large organizations or been pushed out of large organizations to go work for themselves. And one word that people kept using, which I thought was fascinating, was they kept saying to me, Dan, I felt like I wasn't making a contribution. And it really goes to your point, Russ, about the person turning the crank and seeing that there's nothing at the end of the crank. And I think that's inherently alienating. And I think people are willing to work hard and expend effort and do good things, but they have to see some outcome in what they do. It has to contribute. I think there's an existential desire for what you do to actually have some kind of impact on the world. And I think that's a big piece that's missing in a lot of workplaces. And the more that workplaces become in some ways more human, that is, they recognize that people have these mix of drives. They want to contribute. They want to get better at stuff. They want to have some measure of control over their lives. I think it's better for business and it's better for human beings. And the sort of the promise of this humanistic world of business, which we've sort of been held out there for a long time, I think is a little bit closer to realization than it was before.
My guest today has been Daniel Pink. Dan, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
My pleasure, as always.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.